Hi, welcome to day 20 of the Easter tree. Today we're going to study Naomi and Ruth. Please read the book of Ruth, 4 chapters. Here's a little bit of a genealogy. We meet Naomi. Naomi is married to Elimelech, and they have 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. The way the Lord would have it, Elimelech and Mahlon and Chilion have both passed. So you're meeting a woman who has a husband who passed away, and then soon after that, her 2 sons. So this is her livelihood. This is her identity, completely changed. Each of the sons have been married, and that's where we meet Orpah, and then we meet Ruth. So we find Orpah and Ruth are faced with some major life choices. One of the choices was remaining in their own country, staying close to their family members, and then finding a husband where they could kind of have a reset button and begin having a new family. The other choice was to walk into the unknown with your mother-in-law and trust in God's sovereign plan. Orpah decides to stay. Ruth decides to go. A lot of that I want to attribute to Naomi, because to be a daughter-in-law in that culture meant you lived in the home. Obviously, Naomi was discipling her and shepherding her and pouring into her, where she became a woman of faith. She began to believe in the promises of God. She wanted to be a part of God's family. I think a lot of Ruth's decision to stay showed that Naomi was a good mother-in-law to her. In the midst of Naomi's pain, she is letting her daughters go to have a life that she knows she cannot provide for them. So you see Naomi's love and affection for her daughter-in-laws here. I'm sure this kind of affection was fleshed out in daily life as they lived in the home together. So the fact that Ruth didn't want to leave Naomi shows how Naomi's faith had an impact on Ruth. So we see in verse 6 and 7 that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So what does Naomi do? She sets out for Judah. Here already in the opening verses, in the midst of despair, hope is offered. Keep in mind that Ruth's story here never lose sight of the fact that God's faithful love determines history. In this culture, if you look in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 5 through 6, you will see that there's something called a levirate marriage law. This is a law where if the man dies and leaves a widow, the brother is expected to take his place and to preserve the family line. There was a custom in those days where if you died, a close relative was to basically redeem your property and your possessions to keep it within the family. When you bought a deceased person's estate, you were called a kinsman redeemer. This is important to know as a baseline, then it'll help you understand the rest of the story a little bit deeper. The Moabites were related to Israel through Lot. In the long run, there was tension between the Moabites and the Israelites. This is a time period when the Moabites and the Israelites had peaceful relations. Ruth chapter 1, verse 16 through 17. So Naomi is encouraging them to basically go start over and have a life. You're young. Please don't let me burden you. This is going to just change the trajectory of your life. I'm giving you another chance. Go ahead and go free. Well, Orpah says, okay, I'm going. Ruth says, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you will go and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. A choice of homeland is a choice of whether you're for God or against God in this scenario. Here we can no longer assume that both daughters-in-laws are true worshipers of the Lord. In this culture, taking a Moabite wife was not forbidden. However, the male descendants would not be allowed to worship in the temple. Okay. Do you see the irony in this? An heir and an ancestor of King David, ultimately leading to Jesus Christ, the ultimate high priest, could not worship in the temple because he was considered a foreigner. That makes me laugh because I just think God is saying, okay, you know your little petty rules and your little racial prejudices, it doesn't matter when it comes to me. Throughout this book, you'll see that it does not let you forget that Ruth is a foreigner. Keep saying Ruth the Moabite. We see this in chapter 1, verse 4, 2, verse 2, 6, 10, 21, chapter 4, verse 5, chapter 4, verse 10, because it's crucial that she is remembered as a foreigner. If you're not Jewish, You're a foreigner. This is good news for us. And here we meet Naomi at a time of great grieving and tragedy and trauma, a time of great anxiety, a time of great loss. Naomi actually means pleasant. Probably these things that she used as her identity. Children and husband are not idols in themselves, but the way we draw identity from them can be. So here the Lord is taking these things away from her. Just like all of us, we get into despair, we get into sadness, we grieve our losses, as you should too, because your husband has just passed and your children have just passed. So we're certainly not going to judge her for that. What we see here is that Naomi does see that God is the sovereign one who is in control of all things. Naomi is bitterly and painfully acknowledging God's sovereign hand upon what has happened to her. She understands the events are never outside of God's decree. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. In later years, the barley and the wheat harvest can be directly associated with Passover and Pentecost. This symbolizes a time of God's favor, and in Naomi's case, a time of fruitful restoration that's about to happen. Here we meet Boaz, who is a descendant of Elimelech and an ancestor of David. Boaz was a close relative, and he is the Redeemer. So he has certain responsibilities to the family and for their property. This was a way of taking care of their family and taking care of their own without causing circumstances to become dire and so impoverished. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. The word worthy, it usually means an outstanding fighter, but here it means somebody powerful and important in the society. Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him, in whose sight I shall find favor. Ruth's main initiative is to basically put food on the table and to survive and to take care of her mother-in-law and herself. So she's saying, okay, you know what? I gotta go work. I've gotta go get our food. As poor people here, Ruth and Naomi are doing what the scripture says in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 9 through 10, chapter 23, verse 22, and Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 19. They're going to receive some assistance. Because in those days, if you had a lot of land, what would happen was you as the owner would harvest the middle. You would leave the corners here so that those who were impoverished or those who came into dire circumstances would come out and work, and you would basically be letting them take whatever they were willing to work for. This is not welfare. God ordains work. We saw that in Genesis chapter 2, where work was a blessing. We were created to work. But it's when sin entered the world, work became difficult, and we didn't want to anymore. It felt more like a curse than a blessing. Here you see God's way of saying, here, you will be supported, you will have help, but go work. Go get it. It's there for you. Go get it. So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was one of the clan of Elimelech. She just happened to. Or did she just happen to? Oh no. God's fingerprints are all over this one. You never met this guy. How did you just show up and go to the relatives' field? The servant's answer to Boaz, explaining who Ruth is, shows that he highly esteems her character. Because of the culture where it was normal for people to glean on the corners of the lot of the field, she really didn't need to ask permission, but she did. And it shows that she's humble. She's modest in asking permission for something that most people saw as a right. And also she stayed all day, so she's a hard worker as well. She's been busy since morning. Okay, and teenagers, morning does not count starting at 11. She's young, she's faithful, and he knows that she's doing this for the sake of her relative. Chapter 2, verse 8 through 12, it gets good. What a man! Woo! Ladies, you feeling it? I mean, this is revealing traits. This is showing Boaz's provision and protection. These are traits that we love. Why? Because this is our Redeemer. And this is Boaz displaying it, but really he's pointing to Jesus. If this is what is displayed in a human form, can you imagine how much greater Jesus is? Wow. Sign me up. And that's probably why she was so overcome by the love and the provision and the protection that she's been longing for, where she fell on the ground. And she acknowledges in such a humble way her inferiority to his position and to who he is and what he represents. Don't you love when he credits her and he says, for what you have done, and how he blesses her? This part of the story made me think of Psalm 18. Somebody write a song, put it to some good words, put it on a nice melody, please. I'm not that talented. And here you see Boaz knows, even though she keeps saying I'm a servant and a foreigner, he knows, oh, she's not any ordinary foreigner. She has taken refuge under the wings of the Lord, and she will receive full reward from him. Though a foreigner, Ruth's loyalty to God is a key element in God's story of redemption. The plan will be worked out through the covenant King David. It will ultimately be revealed through Christ, David's greater son. The reward of Ruth's faith far transcends the circumstance and this time. Sisters and brothers, how does that look in your own life? I pray you'll be faithful. Let's be faithful. Everything's coming together. So this law of redemption allows, one, avenging the death of a family member, allows for buying back family property that had been sold to pay debts. Also, the law of redemption allows for buying back a relative who had sold himself into slavery to pay debt. The fourth law of redemption is marrying the widow of the deceased relative. These laws could be renounced or declined at any point. Ruth decided to take the destiny of God's law. Events must take their time. We see Naomi is plotting and scheming. Ruth is faithfully and quietly serving. And Boaz, he's finishing the harvest. In chapter 3, verse 10, the kindness that Boaz is talking about, he's acknowledging that Ruth has the freedom to go after the younger guys, because for Boaz to be in a position of such prestige and power, he obviously isn't a spring chicken. But here you see she is choosing to keep God's law and choosing to submit to God's sovereign plan as opposed to going after these richer, younger, cuter looking guys' offers. This shows that Ruth understands God's covenant love. God's own love is mirrored through Ruth. Her faithfulness is proved. She invokes the duties of a close relative, and she has declined to follow the young men. Boaz sees that Ruth understands that she's choosing to follow the proposal and the custom that would provide Naomi an heir. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. Isn't that beautiful? How romantic. I know this isn't a love story, but chapter 4, verse 11 through 12. Ruth is taken as a wife, and these blessings of fruitfulness are being given her. Naomi's bitterness is turned to joy, and her grandson is about to become the grandfather of King David. Don't you love that despite human failures and mistakes, that God's messianic lineage is preserved? You'll see this lineage in Matthew chapter 1, verse 3 through 16. Chapter 4, verse 14 through 15. Naomi's story is a story of this sorrowful woman who has come thinking that she is empty and no hope. But now we find she's been filled beyond her wildest expectations. God's providence and Naomi, willing to take refuge under God's wing, was rewarded by God. And the lineage of faith got to continue. Ruth and Boaz's story is a picture of God's grace and human frailty coming together. The significance of this book in light of the gospel is that we see Ruth has left her family, just like Abraham did, to go to a foreign land under the care of God. It's also a universal scope of the gospel, where she as a foreigner is folded into the blessing promised to all the nations in Abraham's descendants. Ruth becomes an ancestor of Christ, who in himself will reconcile to God such different nations as Moab and Israel. So ponder that. Where do you take refuge? Day 20, Naomi and Ruth. Did you notice I picked pink? I know. Girly colors. Dun, da, da, da. A little attempt at wheat. I took Sculpey clay, and you just form it up. So now, ponder some more, journal, write a song. Would somebody please write an awesome melody to Psalm 18? Take some time to sit with this and think about God as our Redeemer, who has taken us foreigners, who has taken us who are wanting to follow him. Can you say what Ruth said? Where you go, I will go. Follow the Spirit. Let's follow the Spirit. Let's get in touch with the Lord. I have taken this and dun da da da. It's revealed. Boaz and Ruth had Obed, who had Jesse, who was the father of David, and then ultimately Christ came through the line of David. I'll put some helpful links below, so make sure you check that out. And again, thank you for joining me to study God's Word.